You think ghosting is bad? Try being forced to marry a stranger your dad picked when you're 12, and you've never even seen a toothbrush. Welcome to the brutal, awkward, and often disgusting world of medieval dating. In medieval Europe, love and marriage were two very different things, and rarely found in the same place. For nobles, marriage was not a personal choice, but a political tool. It was about land. It was about bloodlines. It was about power. The idea that one would marry for love was, quite simply, absurd. In fact, among the nobility, such a thing was considered dangerous. A noble family's influence depended on its holdings, estates, castles, villages, and who they were allied with. And those alliances were forged not with contracts or speeches, but with the binding force of matrimony. To marry off a daughter was to open a door to another family's army, treasury, and titles. To marry off a son was to expand one's claim to land or strengthen ties to a higher-ranking lord. Every marriage was a transaction, and every bride or groom was a piece on the board of aristocratic chess. Young nobles rarely had any say in the matter. Marriages were often arranged when the children were still infants. A 10-year-old girl might be promised to a boy she would not meet for years. A 12-year-old heir might be pledged to a widow twice his age if it meant acquiring her dowry. These arrangements were not delayed until adulthood. By the time most noble children reached puberty, their fates were already sealed, and those fates were not always kind. For noble women, marriage was less an opportunity and more a duty, and a dangerous one. A girl might be married as early as 12 or 13. Childbirth, often fatal, loomed as a near certainty. Her role was to produce heirs, not just sons, but many sons, and if she failed to do so, she could be cast aside, her honor questioned, her body blamed. Love in this structure was irrelevant. It was not expected. It was not required. It was not even appropriate. Romantic affection, in fact, was viewed with suspicion. To fall in love before marriage was to risk defying family interests. To fall in love after marriage was unnecessary, even foolish. A noblewoman was expected to obey her husband. A nobleman was expected to govern his wife. Their bond was not rooted in emotion, but in obligation and political need. Courtly love, that poetic ideal so often associated with the medieval world, flourished not in the halls of marriage, but outside it. Troubadours sang of longing, not fulfillment. Knights wrote verses to unattainable ladies. But these were fantasies, safe outlets for emotional expression in a world that denied its reality. The lady in the poem was often someone else's wife. The knight could yearn but never touch. This arrangement allowed for romantic ideals without interfering with the cold machinery of marriage politics. This disconnect between love and marriage created strange and often uncomfortable dynamics. A young noblewoman might be forced to wed a man 3 times her age. A young lord might be pledged to a woman he despised or feared, and yet they were expected to carry out their roles, to produce heirs, and to maintain the appearance of harmony. The family's reputation depended on it. In this world, affection became a risk. Love became a secret. Many noble marriages were plagued with tension, infidelity, and emotional distance. Some found comfort in companionship over time, growing into their roles and developing respect. But others lived in quiet bitterness, trapped in alliances they never chose, bound by expectations they could never fulfill. It is telling that many noble women, when given the chance, chose the cloister over the bridal chamber, A convent, while still restrictive, offered a degree of autonomy, education, and spiritual purpose that marriage often did not. It was, in many ways, a quieter form of rebellion, a way to escape the marriage market without dishonor. And yet, while noble marriages were locked in political chains, something curious was happening further down the social ladder. Among the peasantry, love had a bit more room to grow. Peasants were not immune to practical concerns. Marrying someone with a good plot of land or a strong back was certainly sensible, but they were not as tightly bound by alliance and legacy. A young man might court a girl from the next village. A daughter might refuse a suitor her father disapproved of. Feelings, while not the final word, had a place at the table. This is not to say peasant marriages were always happy or free. Parents still played a strong role. Communities still imposed norms. But the lack of political entanglement allowed personal preference to influence decisions more than it ever could among the nobility. The expectations were still clear: hard work, fertility, obedience, but affection could grow alongside them. Even so, love was rarely romanticized. Life was too hard, too short for idealism. A good match was someone who could help you survive the winter, feed your children, and repair the roof. Still, within these rough edges, genuine emotional bonds formed. Laughter shared at the well, hands brushing in the field, a song sung at the feast. These small moments carried more meaning than any alliance forged between kings. In contrast, the noble courtship process was an intricate performance of control and ceremony. Betrothal contracts were drawn up by lawyers and witnessed by clergy. Dowries were calculated down to the last sheep and candlestick. The church, while preaching the sanctity of marriage, also legitimized its politicization. A marriage without consent could be invalid, but whose consent counted was often twisted. A girl might say yes out of fear, a boy out of duty, and the church, needing noble support, often looked the other way. There were, of course, exceptions. Stories of noble lovers defying their families, eloping in the night, or fighting for their right to choose exist. But they were rare and often ended badly. A disobedient daughter could be disinherited. A rebellious son might find himself exiled or executed. The system punished those who tried to bend it, and yet, in secret letters, hidden meetings, stolen glances, love still found its way in. A lady might take a lover. A knight might pledge himself to a woman he could never marry. These liaisons were dangerous, and if discovered, could lead to disgrace or worse. But they spoke to a basic human truth. Love, even in a world that had no place for it, refused to die. Over time, the tension between love and duty would become a central theme in European literature and philosophy. Writers began to question the cold calculations of noble marriages. Poets dared to suggest that love should matter. But in the medieval period itself, these ideas were still subversive. To marry for love was a dream whispered in songs, not a reality lived in castles. To seek affection over advantage was an act of rebellion. In the noble world, love was for peasants, those free enough to feel, poor enough to risk, and distant enough from power to choose. And so, while the lords and ladies paraded in silk and gold, marrying for land and title, it was in the dirt paths and candlelit homes of the commoners where love quietly bloomed. It may not have been grand, it may not have been easy, but it was theirs. In the end, the story of love in the Middle Ages is not one of fairy tale romance, but of conflict between heart and duty. A world where the head ruled the heart and where the price of following one's feelings could be everything a noble family had spent generations building. In this world, love was not a gift. It was a risk that only the powerless could afford to take. In medieval Europe, marriage was not a personal milestone. It was a family negotiation. It was not about desire or emotion, but property, prestige, and strategy. From the grand halls of noble estates to the modest homes of merchant families, the process of arranging a marriage was meticulous and coldly transactional. The key players were not the bride and groom. They were the parents, the guardians, the lords, and sometimes the church. The couple's opinions, if acknowledged at all, were secondary. This practice was not seen as oppressive, it was the norm. The concept of individual romantic choice, while idealized in songs and stories, had little place in the reality of medieval matchmaking. Especially among the elites, a marriage was essentially a business agreement, a contract, sealed with ritual and ceremony, yes, but a contract nonetheless. A noble daughter, even from birth, was seen as a future bargaining chip. Her value lay not only in her name and her beauty, but in what she could bring to another family. A claim to land, a potential alliance, an heir. Similarly, a son was not merely a child, but an asset to extend his family's influence. Parents calculated dowries and inheritance rights long before the children reached adolescence. In some cases, two infants might be betrothed by the time they could walk. The idea that a child might say no to such an arrangement was, for the most part, unthinkable. The family decided, and the child obeyed. In the upper ranks of society, disobedience could be met with punishment, disownment, or worse. The stakes were too high. A single marriage could determine the fate of estates, the outcome of disputes, or the loyalty of vassals. These marriages were negotiated like treaties. The heads of families would meet, often with advisors, and begin the exchange. Terms were discussed. How much land would be included? What possessions would be transferred? Would there be servants, livestock, titles? The dowry, the wealth the bride's family would provide, was a central element. It could include coins, land, fine garments, household items, or rights to income. In return, the groom's family offered protection, status, and ideally, long-term prosperity for the bride and her future children. Once the terms were agreed upon, a formal betrothal followed. This engagement was legally binding. Breaking it could result in penalties, fines, or even blood feuds, depending on the families involved. Gifts might be exchanged, rings, brooches, or religious relics. Sometimes a public ceremony marked the agreement, signaling to the community that the two families were now bound together, even if the children involved barely knew one another. The church played a complicated role in this process. On the one hand, it insisted that marriage was a sacrament that required mutual consent. On the other, it often turned a blind eye when that consent was coerced, manipulated, or entirely absent. For the sake of preserving social order and family power, ecclesiastical authorities often validated arrangements made under pressure. A nod from the bride and groom during the ceremony was enough. Whether they wanted the marriage or understood its meaning was a secondary concern. The process wasn't limited to the nobility. Merchants, landowners, craftsmen, anyone with something to gain or lose participated in this system. A successful blacksmith might seek to marry his daughter into a baker's family, to secure steady grain and bread. A widower with children might look for a young bride with a good dowry to help him keep his household running. Even peasants, though less bound by property, often had marriages arranged by parents looking to secure social ties, labor support, or access to better farmland. Among the lower classes, the negotiations were simpler, but the underlying logic was the same. Marriage was a contract to ensure mutual survival and family advancement. Feelings could grow later, or not. It hardly mattered. Girls especially had little say. In many regions, they could be married off by their fathers as soon as they reached puberty. In cases where the father was absent or dead, a male guardian or even the local lord might step in to arrange the marriage. Legal protections for consent existed on paper, but enforcement was weak. A young girl might be told of her marriage just days before it happened. Resistance was rare and risky. A girl who refused could be punished, shamed, or sent to a convent against her will. Boys, while given slightly more autonomy, were also subject to family pressure. An heir was expected to marry a suitable wife, often chosen for her dowry or family ties. Failing to do so could jeopardize inheritance or damage the family's reputation. Second or third sons, lacking land of their own, might be forced into clerical life or pushed toward marriages that offered economic stability rather than personal choice. The results were predictable. Many couples entered married life as strangers. Some found friendship over time. Others endured lifelong indifference or quiet resentment. Emotional compatibility was a luxury few enjoyed. The practical duties of marriage, managing the household, raising children, maintaining status, left little room for affection. For those who yearned for more, secrecy was often the only path. Illicit romances, affairs, and broken vows were common, though dangerous. A married noblewoman who strayed risked disgrace, exile, or execution. A common woman might face abandonment and poverty. Still, passion found cracks in the stone walls of arranged marriage. Love letters were smuggled, meetings arranged, reputations gambled. Despite the rigid structure, not all arranged marriages were cold. Some couples grew to respect and care for one another. Shared hardships, children, and years of cohabitation could forge a bond, even without a spark at the start. But those cases were seen as fortunate accidents, not goals. The system was designed for survival and strategy, not happiness. In some rare cases, a child's voice could be heard, but only when it aligned with the family's interests. A powerful daughter, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, could negotiate her own match due to her wealth and status. A beloved son might sway his father's decision if the proposed match still benefited the family. But these were exceptions, not rules. And even when children were consulted, the pressure was immense. A girl might say yes to please her father. A boy might agree to avoid punishment. The appearance of consent often masked the reality of coercion. Families used guilt, fear, and duty to shape decisions. Saying no was a risk few were willing to take. Legal loopholes existed, but exploiting them was rare. A couple who wished to marry against their family's wishes might elope or appeal to the church. But without money or protection, they had little chance of success. More often, they accepted their fate and lived with the consequences. As time passed and social structures shifted, the idea of romantic marriage began to gain ground, especially in literature. Stories of star-crossed lovers, of knights and damsels, of forbidden love became increasingly popular. These tales reflected a longing for autonomy, for the right to choose, but they remained stories. In real life, marriage continued to serve power long before it served love. So when we speak of marriage in the medieval world, we must understand it not as a union of hearts, but as a calculation. Children were bartered like livestock, their futures mapped out in coins and acres. A bride was a dowry wrapped in silk. A groom was a path to protection or prestige. And the most tragic truth of all, many never even dreamed it could be otherwise. The idea that one might choose their partner based on love, desire, or shared values, that was a luxury, and in most cases, a fantasy. Marriage was not the beginning of a love story. It was the final move in a family's long game. The family said yes. That was all that mattered. In the grand game of medieval marriage, one factor could make or break the entire process: the dowry. It was more than just a gift or a gesture. It was currency. A dowry was the financial engine behind nearly every marriage negotiation, a payment from the bride's family to the groom or his family. And without it, a girl's chances of marrying, even into modest comfort, dropped dramatically. The dowry defined a woman's value in the marriage market. In essence, it was the bride's contribution to the union, offered by her father or guardian, often with meticulous detail. It could take the form of silver, gold, livestock, tools, land, furniture, textiles, or anything else of measurable value. But it was not charity. It was strategic. It was meant to entice a desirable groom, elevate the status of the bride's family, and, importantly, ensure some financial security for the bride in the event of widowhood or abandonment. The practice of dowries was widespread throughout Europe, from the Italian city-states to the feudal manors of France and England. The wealthier the family, the higher the stakes. Among noble houses, dowries could be enormous, involving entire villages, control of castles, or political favors. In cities where merchant families wielded power, cash dowries were king. Bankers and traders often treated their daughters' marriages like mergers, and negotiations over a dowry could drag on for months. For daughters, the size of the dowry could determine the quality of their match. A larger dowry meant a higher-ranking husband, better protection, a more prestigious family name. A smaller dowry meant fewer options, or, in some cases, no options at all. Girls without dowries, especially among the urban poor or landless peasants, often faced a life of servitude, poverty, or forced celibacy. They might be sent to convents, not because of piety, but because it was cheaper than marriage. This led to what can only be described as dowry wars, intense competition between families to secure the best possible match for their daughters by offering the most attractive dowry they could muster. A father with several daughters might have to choose which one to marry off first, knowing he could not afford dowries for them all. Sometimes, daughters were married in descending order of beauty or usefulness, as harsh as that sounds. The youngest might never marry at all, left to care for aging parents or enter religious life with little fanfare. The burden of dowries distorted family dynamics. Sons were investments, daughters were expenses. A father might take on debt, sell land, or drain his savings to prepare a dowry for a single daughter, hoping the match would bring long-term gain. Brothers often resented their sisters, seeing their inheritance diminished by the sums paid out for marriage. Inheritance conflicts were common. Some fathers tried to solve this by marrying their daughters to cousins. keeping the wealth in the blood, but this sometimes led to genetic and political complications. The dowry system also locked women into transactional roles. A bride was judged not by her wit, kindness, or abilities, but by the weight of her dowry chest. It didn't matter if she was clever, hardworking, or faithful. If her dowry was lacking, she was considered a liability. This was true across the social spectrum. In cities like Florence, Venice, or Paris, a wealthy merchant's daughter with a massive dowry could marry into nobility. Conversely, a noblewoman with no dowry might find herself passed over for the daughter of a prosperous brewer or cloth merchant. Dowries were also deeply tied to social mobility. For upwardly mobile families, especially in the growing urban middle class, the dowry was a tool to climb the ranks. A well-calculated dowry could secure a better match for a daughter, linking her to a higher class and ensuring better prospects for her children. But this strategy came with risks. If the groom's family deemed the dowry insufficient, they might withdraw at the last minute, publicly humiliating the bride's family and destroying her reputation. For women, the consequences of dowry negotiations were lifelong. A large dowry might offer protection, social standing, and if her husband died, the legal right to reclaim part of it for support. A poorly negotiated dowry, or none at all, meant exposure to abuse, neglect, and even abandonment. Some women were sent back to their family homes after marriage if they were deemed unprofitable. In legal disputes, a woman's dowry could determine whether she had a right to stay in her husband's household or be cast aside. To avoid these outcomes, dowries were often recorded with exacting precision. Formal contracts were drawn up, witnessed by clergy or local officials. They included clauses outlining what property would remain in the woman's name, what would transfer to the husband, and what would be returned in case of death or separation. These documents could stretch for pages, especially among wealthier families, detailing everything from the number of sheep to the color of a silver goblet. Some dowries came with strings attached. A father might demand that his daughter live near the family estate, or insist that the first son be named after him. In extreme cases, fathers required a say in household management, or even inserted clauses that allowed them to retrieve specific items, clothes, jewelry, heirlooms, if the marriage soured. This web of financial and social expectations created pressure for all involved. Young women were expected to maintain their appearance and virtue to justify the investment being made on their behalf. Parents, particularly mothers, obsessed over reputation, dowry negotiations, and the status of potential in-laws. Matchmakers, go-betweens, and clerical advisors became crucial figures in arranging suitable unions. In regions where the dowry burden became too heavy, communities sometimes stepped in. In 15th century Italy, charitable organizations called dowry funds were established to help poor girls marry. These funds, often supported by wealthy patrons or religious institutions, collected donations to assemble modest dowries. The idea was to prevent unmarried women from falling into destitution or prostitution. In Florence, the Monte delle Doti served exactly this function, operating almost like a civic bank for daughters. But these charitable acts were only a bandage on a much deeper problem. The dowry system remained a rigid gatekeeper of marital eligibility, defining who deserved marriage and who did not. It created a caste of unwanted women, not because they lacked character, intelligence, or beauty, but because their families could not afford to pay. And for the men, the dowry system shaped expectations as well. A man with ambition might hold out for a bride with a large dowry, even if he was aging or disreputable. Grooms sometimes married solely for the dowry, intending to abandon or mistreat the bride once the money or property was secured. Inheritance laws varied, but in many regions, the husband gained control of the dowry upon marriage, which made women particularly vulnerable to exploitation. In the rare cases where a couple loved each other but lacked the means, they were often forced to marry in secret or elope, risking both scandal and social ruin. Such unions were frowned upon, and the church might hesitate to legitimize them without proper witnesses or documentation. A marriage without a dowry was considered suspicious, even dangerous, as it disrupted the expected order of society. Thus, the dowry wars were not just about money. They were about survival, honor, power, and control. They turned daughters into assets, marriages into financial strategies, and love into an afterthought. And while some individuals navigated these waters with grace, for many, the process was a source of stress, humiliation, and quiet despair. So, if you lived in the Middle Ages and hoped to marry for love, you had better come with a chest full of silver or not come at all. In today's world, marriage is often postponed until both partners feel ready, emotionally, mentally, and financially. But in the medieval world, none of that mattered. Readiness was not measured by maturity. It was measured by age, fertility, and social need. And often, that age was shockingly young. Girls were commonly married off at 12, sometimes younger. Boys, on the other hand, entered marriage slightly later, usually around 14 to 16. This imbalance had everything to do with biology, property, and reproduction. The church recognized 12 as the minimum legal age for girls and 14 for boys. These limits were rooted in ancient Roman law, and medieval society, for the most part, adopted them without question. To the people of the Middle Ages, puberty was the milestone that mattered. Once a girl menstruated, she was deemed a woman, capable of bearing children, and therefore ready for marriage. The question of her emotional or psychological maturity was never asked. A 12-year-old might have barely left the nursery, still more interested in dolls than domestic work. Yet she could be married, pregnant, and managing a household within months. In noble families, this process was accelerated by political ambition. A young girl was a bargaining chip, and the earlier she could be married off, the sooner her family could reap the benefits of alliance. Marrying daughters early also prevented scandal. A virgin bride was not just desirable, it was a requirement. Early marriage ensured that reputation stayed intact and that her body, and therefore her fertility, was safely under male control. For noble boys, the timing was about succession and responsibility. A young heir might be expected to marry as soon as he could physically consummate the union. Producing offspring, especially sons, was a nobleman's most sacred duty. The sooner he married, the sooner he could secure his legacy. Even if he was emotionally immature, surrounded by tutors and squires, he would still be expected to govern a household and oversee estates once married. Among the lower classes, the pressure was slightly less intense, but the trend remained. Peasant girls often married in their teens. While economic hardship sometimes delayed marriage until a dowry could be assembled or a plot of land secured, the general belief persisted. As soon as a girl could bear children, she should. The consequences of these early marriages were immense. For girls especially, the transition from child to wife was abrupt and brutal. One day, she might be helping her mother bake bread or sew linens. The next, she was being led to a marriage bed, expected to submit to a man she barely knew. These girls often entered marriage with no knowledge of sex, no understanding of their own bodies, and no preparation for childbirth or motherhood. Yet these responsibilities fell on them immediately. Childbirth itself was the greatest danger. Young girls with undeveloped hips and weak bodies faced high risks of complications. Mortality rates were horrifying. A girl of 13 or 14 might die delivering her first child. If she survived, she could expect to be pregnant nearly every year of her life, her body battered by constant labor and little rest. Miscarriages, infections, and stillbirths were common. The emotional trauma was silently endured. For boys, marriage was less physically dangerous, but equally overwhelming. A 14-year-old boy still learning to ride a horse or wield a sword might be thrust into the role of husband and future lord. He was expected to lead, to protect, to reproduce, and to uphold his family's honor. Emotionally, many were not ready, but in medieval society, feelings were not a factor. This disconnection between physical maturity and emotional development created a culture where children lived adult lives without adult understanding. A girl who had never left her family's manor might be shipped to another lord's castle to serve as a wife. A boy who had never made a real decision might suddenly find himself responsible for his wife's well-being, his estate's productivity, and his family's political future. The lack of emotional readiness often led to cold, distant marriages. With no shared experience, no chance for friendship or affection to grow beforehand, couples found themselves trapped in formal, transactional relationships. Some adapted, others resented. Abuse was not uncommon. A young bride with no power living in a stranger's household was especially vulnerable to mistreatment. And yet, there was no room for sympathy. Society praised obedience and condemned resistance. A girl who cried or faltered was seen as weak. A boy who hesitated to perform his husbandly duties was mocked. Children were molded into adults, not gently, but through force, pressure, and social expectation. The church, despite preaching moral guidance, did little to protect the young from these arrangements. So long as the marriage met legal requirements, proper age, mutual consent, however coerced, and witnessed by a priest, it was deemed valid. If a young girl objected, her voice was often dismissed. If a boy rebelled, he could be punished or disinherited. In literature, the consequences of such early unions were often glossed over. Young brides appeared in stories, but their trauma was hidden behind chivalric romance or poetic metaphor. The reality was far harsher. Girls faced isolation, pain, fear, and loss, often without any outlet for expression. Their childhood was taken, and in its place was a role they neither chose nor understood. The emotional neglect extended beyond the couple. Families rarely considered the psychological toll. The father focused on securing alliances, celebrated the marriage. The mother, bound by duty, often saw it as a necessary sacrifice. The community, trained by tradition, viewed it as normal. There was no language, no awareness for what we today would call trauma. Of course, not all young marriages were equally tragic. Some couples grew into their roles and formed genuine bonds over time. A boy and girl, married young and raised together, might develop affection, respect, even love. But these outcomes were lucky, not planned. The system was not built for emotional success. It was built for order, inheritance, and control. In rare cases, laws or customs delayed marriage until the late teens. Some regions responding to high mortality rates began encouraging older marriages for better survival. But these were the exception. In the majority of medieval Europe, early marriage remained the rule, especially among the powerful. It is difficult now to imagine the emotional world of a girl married at 12. Her dreams, her fears, her confusion, none of it recorded, none of it preserved. She left no diary, no confession. Her voice is silent in the history books, but her life, and the lives of thousands like her, shaped the foundations of medieval society. Age, in that world, truly meant nothing more than a number. Maturity was not a requirement. Consent was not a safeguard. Emotion was not a concern. The moment a child could be useful to her family, to her husband, to her community, she was handed over. Whether she was ready did not matter. Whether she understood what was happening did not matter. Her purpose was assigned. Her role was fixed. And in that cold machinery of custom and law, personal growth, emotional safety, and the sacred space of childhood were simply swept away. In the nightmare of medieval dating, growing up too fast wasn't a tragedy. It was the expectation. By the high Middle Ages, the church was no longer a distant voice from the pulpit. It was the central authority on life, death, and marriage. If the family had the power to choose your spouse, the church had the power to decide whether your union was even valid. In the ever-complicated world of medieval relationships, love was rare, choice was scarce. But regulation, that was abundant. And nowhere was that clearer than when the church stepped in with its rules, its courts, and its iron grip on what it defined as holy matrimony. Marriage had not always been a sacrament. In the early centuries of Christianity, it was seen as a personal or civil arrangement, a matter for families and communities. But by the 12th century, the Catholic Church had officially declared marriage one of the 7 sacraments, sacred, spiritual, and entirely under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. That meant priests, bishops, and canon lawyers were now deeply involved in every union, from the humblest peasant wedding to the grandest royal alliance. And what followed was a web of rules that could make or break lives. The most bewildering and socially disruptive were the laws on consanguinity, the Church's strict system for regulating how closely related two people could be and still marry. Under canon law by the 11th century, you could not marry someone related to you within 7 degrees of kinship. That included not just direct blood relatives, but cousins, second cousins, and even more distant ties. Calculating these degrees was a task fit for a mathematician, not a medieval farmer. The problem? In small medieval villages, almost everyone was related. Communities were tight-knit, population mobility was low, and generations of intermarriage meant bloodlines were deeply tangled. Avoiding someone who wasn't a distant cousin was nearly impossible. In practice, the 7-degree rule was so restrictive that it became a legal trap. Couples who had been married for years could suddenly find their union declared invalid if a church court, discovered some forgotten ancestral connection, their children would then be labeled illegitimate. Property rights could vanish. Families could be torn apart. The church eventually relaxed the rule, reducing it to 4 degrees by the 13th century. But even that remained a serious barrier. A fourth cousin in a village of 50 households? That was still dangerously close. Worse, records were poor or non-existent. People often didn't know who their distant relatives were, which made compliance both difficult and dangerous. And yet, violations weren't always punished equally. Nobles, kings, and wealthy patrons could obtain dispensations, official permissions to bypass consanguinity rules, usually in exchange for political support, land, or money. For peasants, such grace was rarely extended. The same rule that a baron could bend might destroy the lives of 2 villagers. The church claimed divine authority, but it operated within human politics. Consanguinity wasn't the only complication. The church also imposed restrictions based on affinity, which meant you couldn't marry the relatives of your deceased spouse, your godparent, or even your step-siblings. It extended to spiritual relationships too. If your father had baptized your future wife, you might be considered spiritually related and therefore forbidden to marry. With each restriction, the church's control grew. It dictated not just who you could marry, but how you could marry. A valid marriage, according to church law, required free consent, public vows, and ideally, a priest's blessing. But in practice, many unions were more ambiguous. A couple might exchange vows privately, what the church called clandestine marriage. If both parties agreed and consummation followed, the church was supposed to honor it. But such marriages were risky. Families could contest them. Priests might refuse to bless them retroactively. And if either party changed their story, the other could face accusations of fornication or deceit. As a result, the church encouraged public ceremonies, often held on the church steps before Mass, followed by a blessing inside. The rituals served not just religious purposes, but legal and social ones. A witnessed ceremony created accountability. It helped prevent bigamy and disputes over dowries and inheritance. It let the community acknowledge and enforce the bond. Still, even with these public rituals, the church's courts were flooded with marriage disputes. A man might claim a woman had promised herself to him. A woman might say she had been forced into a union without consent. Parents might drag their children before ecclesiastical judges demanding annulments. The church had to act as arbiter, digging through stories, confessions, and witnesses to determine the truth. The courts did not always side with tradition. In fact, consent, not parental permission, was the cornerstone of church doctrine. In theory, 2 people could marry each other without any involvement from their families, so long as they both agreed and exchanged vows. This idea was revolutionary. It gave individuals a theoretical tool to challenge forced marriages. But in practice, the power of family, community pressure, and the risk of social ruin made this freedom almost unusable. For girls especially, the pressure to submit was overwhelming. A father could lock a daughter in a convent to prevent her from eloping. A brother could beat or disown a sister who chose a husband beneath their social station. The church might uphold the couple's right to marry, but only after long legal battles, often after the damage had already been done. The church also held the power to annul marriages. Unlike divorce, which was forbidden in Catholic doctrine, Annulment meant that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Grounds included consanguinity, lack of consent, previous vows to someone else, impotence, or spiritual affinity. These rulings could be used honorably or manipulatively. A nobleman who, tired of his wife, might dig up some tenuous family link and petition the church to dissolve the bond. A family might challenge a marriage posthumously to reclaim land or dispute inheritance. Despite its deep involvement, the church could not fully police desire. Illicit relationships, secret vows, and unblessed unions remained common. Couples sometimes eloped to avoid parental control, risking excommunication. Others lived as common law spouses, accepted by neighbors but frowned upon by priests. Some young people were caught between their own promises and their family's ambitions, trapped in limbo while church courts debated their fate. And then there were the consequences. Children born outside church-sanctioned marriage were labeled bastards. This designation carried serious legal and social weight. Bastards had limited inheritance rights. They could not claim titles, land, or positions within the church. Their mothers could be shamed, fined, or cast out. In many cases, the stigma lasted for generations, even if the parents later married. Ironically, the church's deep involvement, meant to elevate marriage to a wholly stable institution, often made it more confusing, bureaucratic, and unjust. What should have been a personal bond became a battlefield of paperwork, politics, and ecclesiastical power. The church did offer spiritual guidance. Sermons and teachings emphasized the sacramental nature of marriage, its importance in resisting sin, and its role in Christian life. But this ideal clashed constantly with the economic and political realities on the ground. Marriage was not always about love or even companionship. It was about control. Control over inheritance, over female sexuality, over family alliances. And the church, for all its lofty rhetoric, became a willing participant in that system. By claiming authority over marriage, the church inserted itself into the most private decisions of people's lives, while often ignoring the consequences. A boy and girl who married without a priest's blessing might be condemned even if their bond was sincere. A couple forced to wed against their will might be trapped forever, because the church believed their vows, once spoken, were sacred and unbreakable. And so, as much as the church aimed to protect marriage from corruption and sin, it often became the enforcer of both. Its laws, though rooted in doctrine, served to reinforce the social order, keep women under control, and entrench the power of the elite. In the nightmare of medieval dating, the church wasn't a savior. It was a gatekeeper. And if you were trying to find love, or even just a life partner, in this tangled world of rules, relatives, and rituals, you would quickly learn the hardest truth of all. In a world where love was rarely a choice, where marriages were arranged, emotions were suppressed, and passion was often forbidden, it was inevitable that some would look for alternatives. And in the shadows of medieval society, behind closed doors whispered in markets or buried in forest groves, there existed a world of charms, potions, and magic. For the lovelorn and the desperate, the supernatural became a last resort. But this search for affection came at a price. One misstep, one accusation, and what began as a harmless attempt at romance could end in disgrace, imprisonment, or death. The Middle Ages were not only a time of rigid authority and deep religiosity, but also of widespread belief in the unseen. Superstition was everywhere. The church preached about angels and demons, while peasants believed in spirits, curses, and the power of the natural world. Between those forces stood the village healer, the herb woman, or the cunning man, figures who straddled the line between medicine and magic. They were often the only people many could turn to for matters of the heart. And so, when love seemed out of reach, when a girl's crush ignored her or a wife feared her husband's wandering eye, people turned to these local practitioners for help. The result was a booming underground tradition of love potions, charms, and spellwork, all aimed at winning affection, securing loyalty, or reigniting desire. Love potions were among the most common. Made from herbs, roots, and sometimes far stranger ingredients, these mixtures promised to stir affection, kindle lust, or bind two hearts together. Some were simple infusions: wild thyme for courage, vervain for attraction, or basil for fidelity. Others were more sinister. Mandrake, a plant with hallucinogenic properties and a history of association with the occult, was believed to bring love, but was also rumored to cry out when pulled from the earth. Spanish fly, made from crushed beetles, could cause intense reactions and dangerous side effects. These potions were rarely consumed willingly. A lovesick servant might slip one into a lord's wine. A scorned wife might lace her husband's stew. A girl might add a few drops to her intended's ale during a village feast. In many cases, the recipient never knew. The idea was not to win love through charm or conversation. It was to trigger it through invisible force. Others sought magical charms or amulets. These could be as simple as a ribbon tied in a specific knot, a stone carried in a pouch, or a wax figure buried beneath a lover's threshold. Rituals accompanied these objects: prayers, incantations, or symbolic gestures performed at specific times under the full moon, during Lent, or on a saint's feast day. Some were inspired by Christian iconography, others by older pagan traditions that never fully vanished despite church suppression. There were also spells, spoken or written, that promised to bend the will of another. Some involved writing a person's name with your own on parchment, dousing it in wine or menstrual blood, and burning it while whispering a plea to a spirit. Others required a piece of the beloved's clothing, hair, or a personal item, believed to hold power over the individual's body or emotions. This belief in sympathetic magic, the idea that a part could control the whole, was central to many of these practices. Of course, not everyone turned to love magic for passion. Sometimes it was about control. A wealthy man might seek a spell to make his wife more obedient. A spurned lover might ask for a charm to curse the one who rejected them. In this way, love magic shaded easily into revenge magic, and the line between affection and manipulation blurred dangerously. All of this took place in a legal and religious climate that officially condemned such practices. The church viewed magic as heretical, a form of rebellion against God's will. Even if a charm seemed harmless, it was still an attempt to twist the natural order. Worse, it often relied on invoking spirits, whether saints or demons. That made it not just sin, but potentially sorcery. By the late Middle Ages, this fear grew. The 13th and 14th centuries saw increasing efforts by both church and state to root out magical practices. At first, these were targeted mostly at practitioners of harmful or black magic. But over time, any form of folk healing, charm use, or potion making could fall under suspicion, especially if it involved love. Why? Because love magic challenged authority. It disrupted arranged marriages, undermined patriarchal control, and gave power, especially to women, over something that society believed should be regulated by family, church, and law. Women were disproportionately accused of using love magic. A woman who showed too much independence, a healer with too many clients, or a midwife who understood herbs and fertility might all be accused of witchcraft. The mere possession of certain herbs, belladonna, henbane, rue, could raise suspicion. If a woman was known to have had romantic success outside of marriage, or if a couple's love seemed too intense or too sudden, neighbors might whisper that a potion had been involved. Punishments varied. In some regions, love magic was treated as a misdemeanor, fines, public penance, or time in the stocks. In others, it was prosecuted as a grave offense, and in the worst cases, especially as witch trials swept across Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, women could be tortured, imprisoned, or executed based on little more than rumor. The danger was especially high during times of social strain. In famine, plague, or war, communities looked for scapegoats. A woman who brewed teas for fertility might be blamed for a stillbirth. A man whose lover left him might accuse a rival of using a spell. Trials were often fueled by jealousy, gossip, and fear, not evidence. Yet, despite the risks, people continued to seek love through these means. Why? Because, for many, there were no other options. A peasant girl had no right to choose her husband. A nobleman's daughter might be married off to a political ally. A lonely widow had few suitors. In such a world, magic offered something no priest, parent, or patriarch could provide: hope. And it wasn't just peasants. Some nobles, even kings, were rumored to have consulted astrologers or alchemists for love advice. Hidden within courtly circles were magicians, wise women, and occult scholars who whispered secrets of attraction and charm. Even queens were not immune. Medieval chronicles contain accusations, some true, some fabricated, of royal women accused of using spells to seduce or control their husbands and rivals. This dual existence of love magic, both feared and secretly practiced, created a culture of deep contradiction. Officially, magic was condemned. Publicly, it was denied. But privately, it endured. Behind every arranged marriage, beneath the ceremonies and alliances, lingered the faint scent of herbs, the rustle of charms, and the whisper of desperate prayers. In time, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment would challenge many of these beliefs. Science would begin to replace superstition. But during the medieval period, magic was a language of the powerless, and in matters of the heart, it was sometimes the only language left. Because in a world where you could be married without consent, where your feelings were irrelevant, and where love was a luxury reserved for the few, why wouldn't you try a potion, even if it meant risking everything? So, would you survive a medieval relationship, or would you have been burned at the stake for using a love potion? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me which part shocked you most. And hey, be grateful your worst date didn't involve lice and arranged marriage contracts.